They thought they could erase me, like a smudged pencil mark on a page they wanted clean. They thought when they sent me away I would simply fade my story ending in a quiet room in a place where old women went to be forgotten. They saw me as excess baggage a life lived that had no place in their future. But fate, that sly orchestrator, had a different scene, planned a different script entirely, and it began not with a whimper or a plea, but with the soft click of a mouse in a sun-drenched apartment thousands of miles away from their carefully constructed world. My name is Margaret Vance, and I owned the roof over their heads. It was a Tuesday morning in Denver, a city I now called home, a place that felt solid and real beneath my feet, in a way Tucson never had. The sky outside my apartment window was an impossible, flawless blue, stretching wide and clear like a promise. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of my living room, pooling on the polished hardwood floor, banishing shadows. I sat at a small writing desk, not the imposing executive kind, but an antique piece I'd found in a little shop downtown, its cherry wood smooth and cool. Beneath my fingertips, warmed by generations of unknown hands who had written letters, paid bills, perhaps simply rested their heads in weariness or hope. On the screen before me wasn't a draft of the quiet novel I was contemplating, or emails from the few meaningful connections I had cultivated since moving. It was a property management dashboard, a grid of names, unit numbers, payment statuses. Each line represented a life unfolding beneath a roof. I controlled a small universe contained within the faded stucco walls of a building on the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona. My fingers hovered over one specific line, Unit 2C. Tenant name Hayes, Clara, and Martin. Status past due. A slow, quiet satisfaction spread through me, not a fiery triumph, but something cooler, more profound. Like sipping warm tea on a cold morning, it settled deep within my bones. It was a sense of balance, of scales tipping finally, after years tilted precariously against me. Justice delivered not with a shout, but with the silent power of ownership. They didn't know it was me. That was the exquisite silent power of it all. To them, I was an unknown entity, a faceless landlord, a distant corporation they couldn't reason with, couldn't charm, couldn't dismiss. Sterling Properties, LLC, a company registered in a state known for its privacy laws, managed by a firm that followed instructions without questions, executing directives with impersonal efficiency. My father's legacy rediscovered and repurposed. My quiet justice served cold, delivered through digital forms and automated emails. I scrolled down the list. Other tenants. The retired couple in 1A, Mr. and Mrs. Gable, always paid their rent 3 days early. I had approved their request to repaint their small patio space, and even sent a small potted plant as a housewarming gift when they moved in. The young woman a student in 3B, sometimes a few days late, but she always communicated, always paid, eventually. I'd waived a late fee for her once when she explained her financial aid was delayed. Small acts of quiet kindness for people who saw me not as a burden, but simply as the person responsible for fixing a leaky faucet, ensuring the hallway lights were on, maintaining the space they called home. They saw the building, they saw the manager on site, they saw the quiet improvements, and they felt managed, cared for in a small transactional way. But Unit 2C, for them, there was only the cold, unyielding application of the lease they'd signed, without reading, too eager, too distracted to notice the clauses that allowed for significant rent adjustments based on internal assessments. The threefold rent increase I'd implemented the moment my ownership was finalized. The polite automated responses to their increasingly frantic inquiries. The silence, my silence. They had perfected the art of making me feel invisible, of talking over me, of seeing through me as if I were made of glass. Now it was my turn to be the unseen force, the quiet pressure point in their lives. And in the quiet hum of my Denver apartment, bathed in sunlight thousands of miles from the stucco building baking under the Tucson sun, I was never more visible to myself. I existed undeniably. My presence, though unseen by them, was shaping their reality in a way they couldn't comprehend. It hadn't started with property ledgers and shell companies, of course. It had started as so many significant shifts in life do with loss, sharp and sudden like a ripped seam in the fabric of existence. The spring of 2017 had arrived on the back of a cold, relentless wind that seemed to carry the very breath of mortality. Robert died in his sleep, quietly, peacefully, utterly devastatingly. 32 years. A lifetime built not on grand gestures, but on the comfortable, sturdy foundation of shared routines, inside jokes, whispered across a crowded room, the silent understanding exchanged with a glance. He was the gravity in my life, the quiet anchor that kept me steady when the storms of life hit, as they inevitably do. And then, in an instant, the anchor was gone. The gravity cut, and I was adrift in a vast, empty sea. Our house, the one we'd chosen together, painted together, filled with the accumulation of our parallel lives. Books on shared shelves, photographs chronicling decades, the worn paths we'd made on the carpets, the quiet comfort of side-by-side armchairs. It became a museum of sorrow. His pipe rack still on the mantelpiece, the indentation on the sofa cushion, where he always sat, the faint familiar scent of his cologne that still lingered in the bedroom, a cruel tease. Every object was a stark reminder of what was missing, a silent scream in the face of the void. I couldn't stay. The silence was too loud, filled with echoes of his absence. The emptiness was too vast, each room a cavern of loneliness. It felt like living in a ghost town, and I was the only resident left wandering through abandoned streets of memory, haunted by the past. Selling the house was less a conscious decision and more an instinct for survival. I needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with the past. I needed distance, a physical separation from the life that had ended, a way to break the spell of grief that held me captive in those familiar rooms. The process was a blur of realtors' polite condolences, strangers walking through our history with assessing eyes the clinical language of market value and closing dates. Each step felt like another layer of skin being peeled away, leaving me raw and exposed. I didn't have children of my own. Life takes unexpected turns, guides you down paths you never anticipated, walking paths that sometimes lead away from the most deeply held dreams. Robert and I had wanted them, tried for them, grieved quietly for the empty spaces in our lives. But it wasn't meant to be. Instead, life had given me Clara, my sister Beatrice's daughter, my only niece. Beatrice had died tragically young in a car accident when Clara was just 8 years old. A child suddenly untethered her world, tilted on its axis. I was the one who stepped in without a second thought. Beatrice was my younger sister, my confidant, my dearest friend. Her loss had been a different kind of devastation, a grief I thought had prepared me for Robert's, but it hadn't. And Clara, so small and lost, needed someone to anchor her. I was there. For the scraped knees, the school plays the awkward, turbulent teenage years, the first agonizing heartbreak. I taught her how to braid her own hair, my fingers weaving through her fine brown strands, not just teaching her the physical act, but the patience and repetition it required, the quiet satisfaction of creating order out of tangles. We spent hours in the kitchen making cookies, the air thick and sweet with the scent of sugar and flour, our fingers sticky with dough, our voices low with shared secrets and whispered dreams. I was her confidant, her cheerleader, her safe harbor in the storm of adolescence. I wasn't her mother by blood. No, that distinction was always there, a quiet line drawn by fate. But the threads of connection, the years of shared life, the countless small moments of care and trust, they were woven so tightly, so deeply, that they felt stronger than blood. I was family, the family we built deliberately, painstakingly out of love and necessity and shared history. Clara had grown up, gone away to college, fallen in love with Martin Hayes, a man whose presence seemed to demand more space than he occupied, who talked louder than he listened, and whose ambition seemed to outstrip his kindness or his capacity for empathy. They married, and recently they had bought a house, their first house. One of those sprawling, identical boxes in a new subdivision on the outskirts of Tucson. Beige walls, meticulously manicured lawns that seemed to stretch on, forever matching plastic gnomes, guarding identical driveways. The American dream assembled from a kit lacking soul, but representing a certain kind of aspiration. Clara called after Robert's funeral. Her voice was soft, hesitant, pitched carefully like she was handling something fragile that might shatter. Aunt Margaret, she'd said the name, feeling both familiar and foreign on her tongue after months of less frequent calls. You don't have to be alone right now. Not in that empty house. You could come stay with us. Just for a while. Until you figure things out, until you feel ready. Her offer felt like a life raft tossed into the stormy sea of my grief. A small, wobbly one, perhaps not as sturdy as the ship I had lost, but a life raft nonetheless. I clung to the idea of it, a place to go, a family to be near. I told her I'd think about it. A week later, after the house was sold, after the movers had taken everything away, but 4 boxes of essentials and a few carefully packed mementos, I closed the door behind me for the last time. The lock clicked shut with a quiet finality that echoed the closing chapter of my life with Robert, a sound that felt both definitive and heartbreaking. I pointed my aging car west, towards Arizona, towards Clara, towards a future I hoped would involve belonging, a sense of being part of something again. The first few days in their house were a blur of adjustment, of trying to find my footing in unfamiliar territory. Their 2 young boys, Leo and Finn, 7 and 5, were a whirlwind of noise and perpetual motion. Sticky hands, loud voices, endless questions that tumbled out one after another. They'd look at me with wide, curious eyes, trying to place this new, quiet woman in their already busy, chaotic world. "Are you Grandma Margaret?" Leo asked, once confusing me with Martin's mother. The mistake, though innocent, felt like a small erasure, a reminder that I didn't have the title I had earned through years of care. Martin was mostly absent in those initial days, retreating to his home office, sealed off behind a closed door, or disappearing to the garage to tinker with some project. He wasn't openly rude, not yet. Just peripheral. A man who seemed to prefer his own company, and maybe his wife's to mine, or perhaps any disruptions to his established routine. I tried immediately to make myself useful. It was how I knew to exist, how I felt I earned my keep, how I demonstrated my value. In the quiet years after Beatrice died, being useful was my way of anchoring myself to Clara's life, of proving my worth, of ensuring I wasn't a burden. Now, in this new fragile arrangement, the instinct was stronger than ever. I unpacked my boxes in the basement room they offered me. It wasn't much, a concrete floor that always felt cool, underfoot. A single narrow window set high on the wall that offered only a sliver of the outside world, usually just the top of the fence, and the relentless blue sky. The bed creaked loudly every time I shifted my weight. But it was a space, a place to put my boxes, my grief, my tentative hope, a place to be. I started cooking dinners for the family, simple nourishing meals, roasts fragrant with herbs, pasta dishes rich with simmering sauce, hearty stews. Things that felt like comfort, like the food I'd cooked for Robert, the food I'd cooked for Clara when she was a girl. Meals that felt like home. I did laundry sorting colors and whites folding tiny socks, and superhero underwear the mundane rhythm, a small comfort. I tidied the perpetual chaos of a house with two small, energetic children. I mended a torn curtain in the living room, organized their overflowing pantry, creating small pockets of order in their busy lives. Clara seemed grateful in those initial weeks. Tired, yes, perpetually tired, like so many young mothers juggling work and family. But her smiles felt genuine, her words of thanks heartfelt. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Aunt Margaret," she'd say, collapsing onto the sofa after the boys were in bed, her voice heavy with exhaustion. I saw their financial strain. The weight of the new house payment was evident in the tight lines around Clara's eyes, the quick hushed arguments I sometimes overheard between her and Martin about bills, about unexpected expenses. The costs of two growing boys, the everyday expenses that pile up like invisible weights, seemed to press down on them. I remembered the money from Robert's estate, the substantial sum from the sale of our house. It sat in my bank account, a silent, sterile sum untouched. It felt wrong, useless sitting there accumulating interest while they struggled, while Clara's shoulders grew heavier each day. "Let me help with the mortgage," I offered Clara one evening. We were in the kitchen, the sounds of the boys' bath time drifting down from upstairs, laughter and splashes mingling with Martin's distant voice. She hesitated, her eyes flickering with a mix of obvious relief and something that might have been pride quickly masked. "Oh, Aunt Margaret," she said, wringing her hands slightly. "You don't have to. That's too much. I want to." I insisted, perhaps too quickly, too eagerly. My voice held a tremor of desperation, a deep need to contribute, to feel needed, to anchor myself to this new life, this fragile family unit. It's just sitting there. I don't need it all right now. And this house, it's a good house, a place for you to build your life, raise the boys. Let me be a part of that. Think of it as a long-term investment in our family. Maybe it was the sheer weight of their financial burden, or maybe the appeal of a significant sum of money easing their load. She finally nodded, a soft, grateful smile, finally touching her lips, reaching her tired eyes. "Thank you, Aunt Margaret. That would be amazing. It would help so much. It would take such a weight off." Within the week, I wired over a substantial amount, more than enough for a significant chunk of the down payment. They had leveraged themselves, thin for enough to give them breathing room enough to feel like a lifeline. It felt right. It felt like I was investing in us. In the family, I believed we were building brick by brick, shared meal by shared meal, financial contribution by financial contribution. I thought of it as securing my place, solidifying my belonging. But the return on that investment wasn't what I expected. The money seemed to vanish into the structure of their lives, acknowledged briefly, then absorbed into the mechanics of mortgage payments and household bills. Martin barely acknowledged the money. He treated it like a debt settled, a business transaction, concluded without warmth or personal gratitude. Just a curt nod when Clara must have told him the transfer was complete. Good, he'd said, according to Clara, that takes care of that. That was the extent of the thanks from him. The subtle shifts began then, or perhaps they were already there, just less visible through the haze of my grief and my desperate need to belong. I started feeling less like a welcomed guest and more like staff. Martin's behavior became more pronounced. He would leave his dirty laundry on the floor of the hallway, leading to the basement stairs, a silent, passive-aggressive instruction disguised as carelessness. He'd mutter under his breath about the noise when the boys were just being boys, playing in the living room or running through the house. He'd blame me indirectly, subtly, when dinner was late, because a soccer practice ran over schedule, or a trip to the grocery store took longer than expected. "Guess we're eating late again." He'd grumble pointedly, looking at his watch, his tone dripping with accusation. I ignored it. I told myself he was stressed about work, about the mortgage, despite my help about the responsibilities of being a father and husband. That he was just adjusting to having someone else in the house. I told myself that families navigated these small irritations, these moments of friction, that love meant overlooking small cruelties, absorbing passive aggression, maintaining peace at any cost. My days fell into a relentless routine. Wake early, usually before dawn. Make coffee, tidy the kitchen before anyone else was up. Pack the boys' school lunches with carefully cut sandwiches and fruit. Make breakfast. See them off to school. Clean the kitchen, clean the rest of the house. Grocery shop. Start dinner preparations. Pick up the boys from school or activities. Supervise homework or attempt to, amidst their boundless energy, manage dinner. Clean up the kitchen again. Prepare for the next day. I was a live-in housekeeper, cook, chauffeur, and occasional babysitter. The role I had slipped into the role they had quietly assigned me. Clara's initial tired gratitude began to feel thinner, more performative. Her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. Her, "I don't know what we'd do without you." Aunt Margaret sounded less like genuine appreciation and more like a phrase. She'd rehearsed a necessary politeness for the help she received for the financial burden I had lifted. It felt like an obligation, a script she had to follow. I wanted so desperately to believe I was still building something real, something lasting, that my efforts were seen and valued as contributions to a shared life. But a cold draft of doubt started to creep in around the edges of my carefully constructed hope, chilling me from the inside out. The draft became a chilling wind one night, a wind that swept away the last vestiges of my denial. I'd gone to bed early, my knees aching from a long day on my feet, my body heavy with exhaustion that sleep couldn't seem to touch. The basement room was cool and quiet, the air still. The only sound was the low hum of the house above me, the muffled sounds of their evening routine. Water running doors, closing voices indistinct. I was lying in the creaking bed, staring at the thin crack in the concrete ceiling that seemed to grow longer each day when I heard their voices through the vent positioned directly above my head. Martin's voice was sharp, low, thick with irritation and resentment. "She needs to back off, Clara. Seriously, this isn't her house." Clara's response was quieter, muffled. I strained to hear, pressing my ear closer to the vent. Something about me being lonely, about just trying to feel useful, about not having anywhere else to go. Her voice sounded weary, resigned, lacking conviction. Then Martin, again louder this time. The anger clear and undisguised. Useful. She's not helping. She's just hovering, like a ghost. I didn't sign up for a live-in babysitter/maid, Clara. We needed money for the down payment, sure, but this is not what I signed up for. My breath hitched in my throat, a painful, sharp intake of air. The air in the basement room suddenly felt heavy, thick, suffocating, pressing down on me like the concrete ceiling itself. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tense, the brutal, dismissive words replaying in my mind. Not her house. Hovering. Babysitter/maid. Not what I signed up for. It was a brutal summary of my efforts, a complete and utter dismissal of everything I thought I was contributing, of the person I thought I was to them. I didn't cry. My eyes felt dry, hot, stinging. But something inside me, a fragile structure of hope I had been carefully building, brick by painstaking brick, cracked. Not a loud, dramatic collapse, but a hairline fracture at first, almost imperceptible. A tiny weakness appearing in the foundation. The next morning, the house was back to its normal rhythm. The sun rose, the coffee brewed, the boys got ready for school. No one mentioned the conversation I had overheard. The air in the house felt thin, brittle, charged with an unspoken tension, but they moved through it as if nothing had happened, as if the words hadn't been spoken, as if the crack in the foundation hadn't appeared. Clara asked if I could take Leo to soccer practice that afternoon. Martin handed me his empty coffee mug without looking at me, a silent expectation. I smiled, a thin, brittle thing that didn't reach my eyes. Nodded, took the mug. I drove Leo to practice, sat on the bleachers with the other parents, and clapped with forced enthusiasm, watching him chase the ball across the field with boundless, innocent energy. The normalcy felt like a performance, a play we were all acting in, and I was just trying to remember my lines, trying not to betray the fact that I knew the script had changed. That night I unpacked my boxes again, the same boxes I'd unpacked with tentative hope and a desperate need to belong just weeks before. This time the movements were slow, deliberate, imbued with a quiet sadness. From the bottom of one box, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, I pulled out a small framed photograph of Robert. His smile was wide, genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He looked happy, solid, real. I placed it on the flimsy particle board nightstand beside the creaking bed. "Oh, Robert," I whispered, tracing his face with my fingertip, the glass cool beneath my touch. "What am I doing here? What have I become?" I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the basement pressing in, broken only by the distant sounds of their lives upstairs. I told myself it was a phase, that they were stressed, tired, adjusting, that Martin didn't mean it, that Clara was caught in the middle, that once the boys were older, once Martin got used to me, once Clara wasn't so overwhelmed, things would go back to how they were, to how I desperately wanted them to be. I clung to the belief that the family we had built after Beatrice's death, the bond Clara and I shared, was stronger than this. But the cold wind in the vent had told me the truth. They didn't see me as family, not in the way I needed them to. I was a utility, an extra pair of hands, a financial contribution, a relic from a past life that didn't fit into the sleek, modern nuclear unit they were trying to build for themselves. I was a temporary solution, a convenience. And still I stayed. I stayed because admitting the truth felt like admitting failure on a monumental scale. Failure to build a family of my own with Robert. Failure to be loved enough by Clara to be truly seen. failure to find a place in the world after decades of being anchored to another person. It was easier somehow to endure the quiet, insidious pain of being invisible than the searing public pain of being explicitly rejected, asked to leave. I clung to the illusion that closeness was something I could earn, something I could buy, with meals and laundry and quiet compliance. That if I just kept giving, kept being useful, kept staying silent, eventually, the love and acceptance I poured out would be reflected back. But illusions, like old houses built on shaky foundations, have a way of crumbling. Slowly at first, then all at once. 1 year passed. A year measured in swallowed words, in footsteps muffled on the stairs so as not to disturb the world above, in the quiet solitude of the basement room that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. A year of being present but unseen, needed for the tasks I performed, but unwanted as a person. It wasn't dramatic. No screaming matches that ripped through the suburban quiet. No doors slammed in theatrical anger. Just a slow, steady, soul-crushing erosion of my place in their lives. Clara had perfected the art of polite distance. Our interactions were clipped transactional. Thanks, Aunt Margaret. Could you grab this from the car? Sure. Okay. The ease we once shared, the shared laughter, the deep talks that had lasted for hours, felt like memories of another person in another lifetime. A life that had belonged to the girl who had lost her mother and found solace in my care. She moved through the house with her phone perpetually in her hand, her attention focused elsewhere, her eyes rarely meeting mine for more than a fleeting second. The girl who used to curl up beside me on the sofa, telling me her dreams and fears was gone, replaced by a woman I barely recognized, whose priorities seemed to shift constantly, leaving no stable ground, no room for me. Martin, on the other hand, had no such subtlety. He wore his irritation like a badge of honor, displaying it for anyone, especially me to see. His comments, once whispered or implied through veiled complaints, became sharper, delivered with a smirk that was meant to signal a joke, but landed with the precise stinging force of a slap. He started calling me names not to my face in a direct confrontation, but loudly enough that I could hear. "The antique," he'd mutter as I walked past. "The old lady down in the dungeon." If he was talking to Clara nearby. Most often and most cuttingly, the splinter. "You're like a splinter, Margaret," he said once, leaning against the kitchen counter, watching me prepare dinner with that familiar smirk. "You don't kill anyone but God, are you irritating?" His laughter was a short, unpleasant bark. I would flinch my hands, tightening on the knife I was chopping vegetables with, or gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles were white. Jokes weren't supposed to make your stomach twist with nausea. They weren't supposed to make you wary of every creak of a floorboard overhead, every approaching footstep. He increasingly used possessive language, drawing invisible boundaries with his words. My house. My rules. In my house, we do things this way. It was a constant low-level drumbeat, a relentless assertion of ownership that served as a continuous reminder that I was an outsider, a guest who had long since overstayed her welcome, an intruder in his domain. I retreated further into myself, into the quiet confines of the basement. I stopped using the upstairs bathroom, waiting until late at night or early in the morning when I was sure no one would see me. I stopped watching TV in the living room, preferring the flickering screen of my old laptop in the solitude of my room. My world shrank, defined by the concrete walls of the basement. My companions were my books, my knitting needles, the photo of Robert, and the ever-lengthening silence that seemed to swallow up my presence. Even the boys, Leo and Finn, once so open and affectionate, began to change. Children are perceptive. They pick up on the tension, the unspoken rules, the subtle cues from the adults they rely on. They started looking at me with a hesitant wariness, a distance I hadn't seen before. One evening I offered to read Leo a bedtime story, a ritual I had cherished with Clara when she was a girl, stories shared in the quiet intimacy of twilight. He shrank back slightly, shaking his head, his eyes fixed on the floor, mimicking his father's avoidance. Daddy says you're spooky." The word landed like a stone in my chest, cold and heavy. Spooky. An old woman relegated to the basement, a ghost in their eyes, someone to be wary of. I smiled, a thin, brittle thing that didn't reach my eyes, a performance of nonchalance. "Okay, sweetie," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe tomorrow." But I knew with a certainty that chilled me that there wouldn't be a tomorrow for bedtime stories. After that, I stopped trying to connect with them to bridge the distance that had grown between us. I became a quiet presence, a shadow moving through their home. I cleaned, I cooked, I folded laundry, always mindful of the noise I made, trying to be smaller, quieter, less noticeable, less irritating. I stopped humming while I worked in the kitchen. Drawing attention felt dangerous. It risked confirming what I already suspected, what Martin's words had made brutally clear, that in their eyes, I was no longer part of them, just a burden, a specter from a past they wanted to forget. Martin's remarks chipped away at me constantly, small, persistent blows that eroded my sense of self. You don't get to rewrite history just because you're still here. He'd snap if I brought up a shared memory with Clara that included Beatrice or Robert, a memory that rooted me firmly in their family history. Why do old people never know when to leave? He muttered loudly one morning as I came upstairs for tea, pausing dramatically at the top of the basement stairs, as if waiting for me to hear. I told myself I was rising above it, ignoring him, refusing to engage with his pettiness, his cruelty. But the truth was, it hollowed me out. It left a vast, echoing space inside me, where my self-worth used to reside. I clung to small moments like precious crumbs tossed to a starving bird. Leo scraping his knee on the driveway, and in his momentary pain, letting me hold him for a fleeting second, burying his face in my side, before Martin's sharp voice cut through the moment, calling him away. Clara's absent thanks for doing the laundry tossed over her shoulder as she hurried past me in the hallway, her attention fixed on her phone. Crumbs. Small, unsatisfying crumbs. But I was starving for any scrap that felt like connection, that felt like family. So I gathered them, polished them in my mind, tried to make them shine brighter than the surrounding darkness of my isolation. Then came the dinner. It was the final deliberate act that shattered the fragile facade of my belonging. I spent the entire afternoon preparing it. It wasn't just a meal. It was an offering, an attempt to connect, to remind, to perhaps conjure a flicker of the past we had shared. Roasted chicken fragrant with lemon and rosemary, the skin browning to a perfect crisp in the oven. Mashed potatoes whipped to creamy perfection with butter and milk. Homemade biscuits, warm and fluffy, a recipe Beatrice had taught me years ago. A recipe I used to make for Clara on days she was sad or had a bad day at school. Days when she needed comforting. She called it her comfort meal. I wanted to offer that comfort now to all of them, to remind Clara of a time when our connection was simple and strong, to show Martin that I could contribute something of value, something rooted in love and history, not just utility, to perhaps even coax a smile from the boys. I set the table with meticulous care. Cloth napkins, not the usual paper ones. A small, simple candle I found tucked away in a cupboard, lit to add a touch of warmth, a hint of occasion. I wanted the room to feel welcoming, to feel like us, like the family I kept hoping against hope we could still be. They came in late, the familiar sound of their car pulling into the driveway, a signal that tightened the knot in my stomach. The boys tumbled in, fractious, overtired from a long day of school and after-school activities. Martin's face was already set in lines of annoyance, his jaw tight. Clara looked utterly exhausted, her eyes dull, her shoulders slumped. She barely glanced at the table as she came into the kitchen, didn't comment on the candles or the cloth napkins. The lack of acknowledgement even before the meal began felt like a small, familiar ache. Martin sat down abruptly at the head of the table, his movements sharp, jarring. He looked at the spread I had laid out, his eyes sweeping over the golden chicken, the mounds of potatoes, the basket of warm biscuits. A beat of silence stretched thick with my anticipation, with my quiet hope. Then he laughed, a short, sharp, dismissive sound that pierced the hopeful atmosphere I had tried to create. "Are we doing Thanksgiving now?" he asked, the sarcasm heavy in his voice, directed solely at me. He didn't wait for an answer. Didn't realize I needed a holiday just to eat mashed potatoes. Clara didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She just reached for a biscuit, her movements slow, weary, as if even that small effort was too much. Martin picked up a piece of chicken, took a single performative bite, chewed slowly, and then made a face of exaggerated distaste, letting the bite fall back onto his plate. He pushed his chair back from the table, the legs scraping loudly on the tile floor. He stood. He picked up the entire platter of roasted chicken, the centerpiece of the meal, the culmination of hours of effort and quiet hope. He walked across the kitchen deliberately to the trash can, lifted the lid with his foot, and dumped the entire contents of the platter into the bin. The sound of it, the thud and clatter of the cooked chicken hitting the plastic bin liner, was louder than any shout, louder than any argument I had ever overheard. It was the sound of love, discarded of effort, dismissed of hope, thrown away like garbage. Clara sat frozen in her seat, her hand still reaching for the biscuit, her eyes wide. The boys looked confused, their tired faces questioning. Finn, the youngest, whimpered softly, "Is dinner cancelled?" I said nothing. I couldn't. My throat was constricted, my lungs felt empty. I looked at my hands resting on the table. They still smelled faintly of garlic and rosemary, the scent of hours of preparation, of care poured into food, of love offered and brutally rejected. And that was the moment. Not Martin's cruel action, not his cutting words, not the sound of the chicken hitting the trash, but the silence that followed. Clara's stunned silence, the boys' confused silence, my own stunned, aching silence. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. No one defended the hours I had spent, the care I had put into trying to create something good, something familiar, something that felt like home. In that deafening silence, I finally knew, with absolute certainty, it wasn't my home. Maybe it never had been. Not truly. But still incomprehensibly I stayed, for a little while longer. I stayed because the alternative was a vast, terrifying unknown. The thought of leaving, of being utterly alone again with no Robert, no Clara, no familiar structure felt paralyzing. Starting over at my age in my early 60s felt less like a brave new chapter and more like a punishment for failing at the chapter I was in. I told myself they needed me, that I was helping them manage their busy lives, that I was contributing financially, even if they took it for granted. But the crushing truth, the one that whispered to me in the dark of the basement room, was that I needed them. Or at least I needed to believe I still mattered to someone, that my life still had a purpose beyond solitary existence, that I hadn't become a forgotten relic, collecting dust in someone else's life waiting for an inevitable end. I wasn't angry yet. Anger felt too energetic, too demanding, requiring a strength I didn't possess. I was just tired, profoundly bone-deep, tired. The kind of exhaustion that came not from physical exertion or lack of sleep, but from the relentless draining effort of trying to be seen, trying to be needed, trying to belong to people who had already decided to look away, to shut me out. It was early evening when Clara came down the basement stairs. I heard the faint, deliberate click of her heels on the concrete steps long before she reached the bottom. There was a specific way Clara moved when she was trying to be casual, when she wanted something difficult to feel like a conversation, not a confrontation, a decision already made. Her steps were too slow, too measured, too soft. She already carried the weight of what she was about to say, the script already written. She stopped at the foot of the stairs framed in the doorway between the dim basement and the brighter, warmer upstairs world. It was the physical representation of my place in their lives. Perpetually, on the threshold, never fully inside, always separate. She clasped her hands in front of her, twisting them together slightly, a nervous gesture I remembered from her childhood when she was preparing to confess a minor transgression. Her eyes, when they finally met mine across the dim space, held something I couldn't quite decipher. Pity guilt, a practiced kindness designed to soften the blow. It all blurred together in my weary vision. "Aunt Margaret!" She began, her voice pitched carefully, keeping it light, almost cheerfully, the tone utterly at odds with the somber atmosphere. Martin's father. He heard about this wonderful place, a really lovely community. She talked about an assisted living community. She used the language from the brochures, the kind designed to sound appealing, inviting. Beautiful grounds, she said, her voice gaining a rehearsed lilt. Vibrant community, lots of activities. Card games, gardening clubs, movie nights. She painted a picture of cheerful, silver-haired residents playing cards in sunny rooms, gardening in raised beds, taking exercise classes designed for seniors. A place, she emphasized, where I would have my own space, my independence, my own life surrounded by people my own age. It was a carefully constructed narrative designed to soften the blow, to make exile sound like opportunity, like a desirable next step. She added that they had already looked into it, already made arrangements, already covered the first month's costs, just to help with the transition, to make it easier. She presented it as a gift, an act of thoughtful generosity, not the calculated removal. It was a strategic solution to the splinter in their lives. She finished finally with the line that pierced through my numbness like a shard of ice lodging itself firmly in my chest. "You'll be happier there, Aunt Margaret. You'll be happier there. Away from us. Removed from your grief that reminds us of the past. Removed from our lives where you no longer fit. Removed to a place where you won't be a burden, where you won't hover, where you won't try to cook us dinner or ask about our day. You'll be happier there, away from the family. You helped build the family that no longer wants you as part of its present or future." I nodded. I think I even managed a small smile, a twitch of my lips that might have looked like acceptance from a distance. My throat felt tight-sealed shut, as if my voice box had simply ceased to function. Words wouldn't come. What words were there anyway? Should I ask about the money? The significant sum I had given them for this house, the down payment that had enabled their suburban dream. Should I ask how long they'd been planning this, discussing this behind my back? If the boys would even notice I was gone, or if they would simply be told Grandma Margaret went somewhere she'd be happier. No. The answers didn't matter. They wouldn't change the fact of the door being closed in my face politely but firmly. I waited until she had finished her carefully delivered speech, until she had turned and walked back upstairs, her footsteps fading into the general hum of the house. The door didn't slam. It closed softly, a quiet click that somehow felt more devastating than a loud bang, as if volume at that point made any difference to the shattering happening inside me. I sat down on the edge of the creaking bed and stared at the wall, the same concrete wall with the same thin crack near the corner that seemed to mock my presence. I had once taped a small photo of baby Clara there, her gummy smile a beacon of hope, a reminder of the love that had felt so real. The photo was packed away now, along with the rest of the small collection of things I still clung to. The last tangible links to a life that felt increasingly like a dream I'd had. 2 bags. That's all I allowed myself. One for clothes, a few changes, practical things. The other for the remnants of my life that still held meaning, the tangible pieces of my identity, not tied to this house, this family, this disappointment. My wedding ring, though it hadn't been on my finger since Robert died, kept in a small velvet pouch. A soft wool scarf he'd given me for our 25th anniversary, smelling faintly of his pipe tobacco. A stack of letters from Beatrice, her neat, precise handwriting, a ghostly presence from a life cut short, photographs, some framed, some loose, chronicling decades, moments of joy and sorrow, of a life that felt increasingly like it belonged to someone else, someone stronger, someone who hadn't ended up here. I packed methodically, numbly. No tears came, no wrenching sobs. I didn't pause over each item, didn't linger over memories. My hands moved with the quiet, efficient resignation of someone who had been broken in, who understood the futility of resistance, who simply wanted the pain to be over, packing up the pieces of a life that no longer fit a life that had been deemed surplus to requirements. I called a cab from my phone, the impersonal interaction, a strange contrast to the emotional turmoil churning inside me. I didn't wait to say goodbye to anyone. I didn't go upstairs to see the boys, to see Clara or Martin. There was nothing left to say, no parting words that would bridge the vast chasm that had opened between us. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say thank you for the bed for the roof, for the small cold corner of their world they had grudgingly allowed me to occupy for a time. There was nothing to thank them for. The cab arrived, a nondescript sedan pulling up to the curb. I carried my 2 bags outside, the night air cool against my face. I got in, gave the driver an address for a motel I'd found online, a cheap place near the edge of Tucson. As the car pulled away, I looked back at the house. The windows were dark except for a faint light in one of the upstairs rooms. It looked like any other house in the subdivision, anonymous and quiet. The house I had helped them buy. The house where I had become a ghost. The house that was no longer mine had perhaps never been. The motel was on the extreme edge of Tucson, the kind of place tucked away behind a gas station and a fast food restaurant, smelling faintly of stale cigarettes and the quiet desperation of temporary stays. The vending machine in the lobby had a single flickering fluorescent light, casting long, distorted shadows. A sign taped to the wall warned guests to keep the noise down after 10 p.m., as if anyone staying there had the energy or inclination for anything louder than a sigh, a choked sob, the quiet click of a closing door. My room smelled of old smoke and the sharp chemical scent of cheap disinfectant, a smell I would get used to if I stayed long enough. The window looked out onto a narrow alleyway between buildings. A battered trash bin leaned against a brick wall, its lid ajar. A stained mattress lay discarded beside it, half covered in something dark and unidentifiable, a symbol of a life carelessly discarded. I sat on the edge of the thin mattress, its springs groaning in protest, and stared at the carpet, brown with dark spreading stains like Rorschach blots. Each stain seemed to hold a question I didn't want to ask, a painful truth I didn't want to face. That night, the silence was different from the one in the basement. It wasn't the silence of trying to be small, of holding my breath. It was the vast, echoing silence of being utterly, completely alone. Martin's voice calling me dead weight, a burden, a problem he'd finally solved, replayed in my mind like a broken record. But it was Clara's face that haunted me more deeply. Her carefully kind voice, her insistence that I would be happier there. The way she had framed my expulsion as an act of thoughtful, compassionate care. It was a cruelty masked in concern, a betrayal wrapped in a bow of false kindness, and that felt like the deepest cut of all. That night, lying awake in the impersonal darkness of the motel room, I realized something terrifyingly simple. A truth that had been hiding in plain sight. I wasn't just alone now. I had been alone for a long, long time. Even when I was living in their house, surrounded by the sounds of their lives, I was separate, disconnected. The basement had been the physical manifestation of my isolation, a place to put the person who no longer fit out of sight, out of mind. I asked myself, how did I get here? Not just to this dingy motel room with its smells and its stains and its view of discarded things, but to this place in my life. How had I become so reduced, so diminished, so utterly invisible? How had I become someone so easy to cast aside, so easily erased from a family I had poured my heart and soul and finances into the woman I used to be? The one who navigated life side by side with Robert, a partnership of equals. The one who raised Clara with fierce devotion, her protector, her confidant. That woman would have fought. She would have demanded answers, closure, recognition. But grief changes you in fundamental ways. It doesn't just hollow you out. It rearranges your very structure, shifting your priorities, sapping your will, your fight. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped breathing for myself. I was holding my breath, trying to be small enough, quiet enough, acceptable enough for everyone else, in the hopes that they would grant me a sliver of space in their lives. I lay on the stiff motel bed staring up at the ceiling, where the single light flickered erratically, unable to settle. And for the first time since Robert died, I truly couldn't breathe. Not from grief, not from physical ailment, but from the sheer crushing weight of truth, the suffocating realization of my own vulnerability, my own powerlessness. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to offer, nothing left to hope for from them. Just me. 2 suitcases holding the remnants of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, and a truth I didn't know what to do with. I had become a stranger in the family I had built with my own hands, brick by painstaking brick of effort and love and sacrifice. A stranger in their house. A stranger in my own life. A few days later, still in the motel room, the smell of disinfectant and old sadness clinging stubbornly to everything, I finally found the strength to open the second suitcase. It had sat in the corner, a silent, intimidating presence, a Pandora's box I was afraid to open. It held the pieces of my life I couldn't bear to leave behind, the tangible links to a past that felt increasingly distant, increasingly unreal. The scent that rose from the suitcase was different from the room's oppressive smell. Dust, old fabric, yes, but also something faintly sweet like dried flowers pressed between the pages of a much-loved book, a forgotten sachet tucked amongst old clothes, beneath a folded wool shawl, the soft one Robert gave me for our 25th anniversary, its texture still familiar against my skin, and a faded photograph of him holding a baby Clara, a tiny bundled miracle in his strong arms. I found the box. It was small cardboard, maybe shoebox size, its edges softened with age corners slightly crushed from years of being tucked away. It was the kind of box you stash away in a closet under a bed filled with things you don't quite know what to do with, but can't bring yourself to discard. A repository of forgotten treasures or unresolved histories. I didn't remember packing it. Maybe it had been swept up in the frantic, numb movements of leaving tossed into the suitcase as an afterthought. Or maybe buried deep in my subconscious in that place where intuition resides. I knew I would need it. I lifted it out, its weight surprisingly light, belying the potential weight of its contents. I placed it carefully on the thin-stained motel blanket and opened it slowly as if I might disturb whatever slept inside. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with faded ribbon or loose. Some in my mother Beatrice's sharp, decisive script, written to friends or distant relatives. Others in hands I didn't recognize. Old receipts from trips I barely remembered taking. A few newspaper clippings yellowed and brittle with age. A dried corsage, its petals crumbling to dust at the edges from a high school dance. I could only dimly recall a fleeting moment of youthful hope, captured in faded silk. Time had bleached and faded the papers, the ink. But the emotions, the echoes of those moments still clung to them. Ghosts in the airless room. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I just needed to touch the past, to feel anchored to a history that was mine, untainted by the recent pain, not tangled up with Clara and Martin, and their carefully constructed life, not defined solely by my relationship with Robert. I needed proof that I hadn't just materialized in this dingy room rootless and adrift, that I came from somewhere, from someone. That's when I saw it, tucked beneath the layers of letters and mementos distinct from the others. A single envelope, sealed the flap, still holding firm, thicker than the others with a satisfying weight to it. Addressed to me my full name, Margaret Vance. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, deliberate, a style I had never seen before. Yet it felt strangely familiar, like something I should know. The ink had bled slightly into the paper's fibers, softening the edges of the letters. The paper itself was different, heavier cream-colored with a faint texture, and it smelled faintly of something old and quiet, like a library or a forgotten attic, a scent of history and stillness. The postmark was faded, almost illegible, but the date was still visible, July 1980, more than 40 years ago. I sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope resting on my palm, its weight a mystery. The return address had no street or city, just a name T. Sterling. Thomas Sterling. The name meant nothing to me. No one in my known family bore that name. Yet looking at the envelope, feeling its substance, I felt a strange tug in my chest, a deep, unsettling tremor. It felt like a memory trying to surface a forgotten melody playing just out of reach of consciousness, a whisper from the past. I opened the envelope with careful, almost reverent fingers, afraid I might tear. The paper might somehow damage the fragile link it represented, whatever it was. Inside was a handwritten letter, 3 full pages neatly folded. The ink was faded in places, but the elegant script was still legible. The first line stopped my breath in my throat, a gasp I couldn't quite suppress. "My name is Thomas Sterling, and I am your father." I read the line. Then I read it again. Then I read the whole letter through my eyes, scanning the words, trying to absorb their impossible meaning. Then I read the line again. My father. It felt impossible. A story someone would invent to fill an unbearable void, a wishful fantasy. But the elegant script, the deliberate words, the details he included, they felt real. He wrote about my mother Beatrice. He called her my Beatrice. He wrote about how they had met in Santa Fe decades ago, a brief, intense connection, a summer romance that had bloomed unexpectedly. It wasn't meant to last, he wrote, acknowledging the circumstances. But it had never really ended for him either. He hadn't known about me until years later after I was born, after Beatrice had moved on with her life, married my stepfather, built a family that, on the surface, excluded him. By then, he wrote, she had made it clear to mutual acquaintances through carefully delivered messages that she wanted nothing from him. No contact, no disruption, no claim on his part. She had built her life, and his presence, his past, was not welcome in it. But he had stayed nearby anyway, he wrote, not close enough to interfere, not close enough to disrupt the life she had chosen, but close enough to know to observe from a distance, just in case things changed, just in case she ever reached out, just in case I ever existed in a way he could acknowledge. They never did. He said he had tried writing to me once years ago, when I was a teenager, a letter introducing himself, explaining, but he never mailed it, unsure if it would cause more harm than good, respecting Beatrice's wishes, even after the years had passed. He kept it along with other important papers related to his quiet life and his small, steady investments, in a box he left with someone he trusted implicitly, a lawyer named Arthur Finch in Denver, Colorado. The letter explained that Arthur Finch was instructed that if I ever came looking, if I ever reached out, if I ever felt truly lost and in need of a foundation, something solid to stand on, it would be there. It wasn't a grand fortune, he stressed, writing with a quiet humility, nothing that would make headlines or change the world. But it was substantial, enough to provide security. Enough, perhaps, he wrote, to build a life on a life of my own choosing. He had no other children, no wife. He had set things in motion years ago, a trust established, instructions given to Arthur Finch. If I never appeared, if I never found the letter, or Arthur Finch, the money and the property would be donated to a scholarship fund established in Beatrice's name at a small college she had attended briefly. A final quiet tribute from the man who had loved her, even from a distance, even when she wanted nothing from him. It sounded like a fable, a story a lonely woman adrift in grief and rejection might invent to keep from succumbing to despair. But I folded the letter slowly, carefully following the original creases. I held it against my chest. The paper had a strange weight to it, as if it held more than just ink and words. It held a lifetime of unspoken possibility, of what-ifs, of a parallel history I had never known. It held breath, regret, and something that might have been love, a love that had existed for Beatrice, and perhaps from a distance for me, if it had been given the chance to grow to be acknowledged. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I lay on the thin motel mattress, the letter from Thomas Sterling lying beside me on the scratchy blanket, staring at the ceiling, where the single light continued its erratic, flickering dance. I tried to conjure the face of this man, my father, a stranger who had apparently carried my existence in his thoughts for decades, who had planned for a future he might never be part of. I sifted through my memories of Beatrice, searching for any hint, any slip of the tongue, any photograph I didn't recognize, any name she might have mentioned in passing. But she had been fiercely private about her past, especially anything before her marriage, to my kind, steady stepfather, the man I had always believed was my father, until this letter arrived. She had kept her secrets well, perhaps too well. In the morning, the motel room, though still smelling of old smoke and disinfectant, felt less bleak, less final. The stained carpet, the view of the alley, they were just temporary backdrops. The letter had changed everything. I found the name of the law office online, Finch & Associates, LLC. It still existed. The website was simple, understated, nothing flashy, just a list of services, a few credentials, a phone number. It felt solid, real, a connection to the world outside the confines of my grief and this room. I stared at the number for nearly an hour, my finger hovering over the screen, before my hand finally reached for the phone. The woman who answered sounded polite, efficient, professional, but distant, until I spoke the name, my voice a little hesitant. Arthur Finch. Something in her voice shifted immediately. A ripple of surprise, then something warmer, more attentive, as if she had been waiting for that name. She asked me to hold. The waiting music was generic, tinny, impersonal, a stark contrast to the sudden, intensely personal nature of my call. When she returned to the line, her tone was completely different. "Mr. Finch is retired now," she said, her voice soft, respectful. "But he still comes into the office a couple of days a week to see to a few long-standing matters. He'll be in on Friday." She paused, then added, her voice dropping slightly. "And yes, he said he would absolutely want to speak with you. He's been expecting... Well, he'll want to speak with you." I hung up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. Doubt, sharp and cold, immediately flooded in again. What if it was a mistake? A cruel joke, a misunderstanding? Or worse, just a delusion born of grief and desperation. My mind inventing a rescuer where none existed. But beneath the doubt, a quiet certainty whispered back. Even if it was just the smallest thread, it was a thread connected to my past, to a part of me I hadn't known existed. It was mine to pull, to investigate, to follow wherever it led. By Thursday night, I had packed again. Not much, just the essentials. The clothes I had brought, the second suitcase with its precious, unexpected contents. I left the motel key on the nightstand, with a short, impersonal note thanking the manager. I didn't need the stale air, the stained carpet, the view of the alley any longer. I didn't need to be adrift. Then I walked to the bus station. The air was cool and dry under the vast desert sky. I bought a one-way ticket to Denver, Colorado. The bus ride was long, stretching across states that blurred together in the window. The baked browns and golds of the Arizona desert gave way to the vast, flat plains of New Mexico and Colorado, the landscape slowly shifting subtly, changing its palette. Then in the distance, the hazy outline of mountains began to appear, growing closer, more defined with every mile, their snow-capped peaks catching the sunlight. The air grew thinner, cooler, as the road climbed towards the Rockies. I sat by the window watching the world roll by 1,000 shades of unfamiliar terrain, each passing mile, taking me further from the life I had lost, further from the rejection I had endured, closer to an unknown future. I didn't talk to anyone. I kept to myself, a solitary figure amidst the transient crowd of travelers. I didn't sleep much, my mind too restless, replaying the events of the past year, rereading the letter from Thomas Sterling, trying to reconcile the man who had been my stepfather with this new, unexpected figure from my past. I held the letter in my lap the entire way, its presence a quiet, tangible reassurance. It felt like a talisman, a key to a door I hadn't known was there, a connection to a lineage I had never suspected. When the bus finally pulled into the station in downtown Denver, after what felt like an eternity, my legs were stiff, my eyes tired from lack of sleep and endless contemplation. But as I stepped onto the platform, a different kind of tiredness lifted. The crushing weariness of expectation, of trying to fit in, of being small, that began to dissipate. It was replaced by something else. Not quite hope, not yet. I was too afraid to name it. More like the echo of hope, a ghost of the feeling before life had taught me better, before grief and betrayal had tempered my expectations. I stood on the sidewalk outside the station, the city noise swirling around me, the roar of traffic, the hurried footsteps of commuters, the distant wail of a siren. It was different from Tucson, the air crisper, the energy faster. I gripped the handle of my small suitcase, and I told myself, my voice a quiet whisper in the urban din. This isn't the end. This isn't even the middle. It's just the next page. And somewhere out there, behind a quiet office door, a man who knew my father was waiting. The journey had brought me here to a threshold. What lay beyond it was still unknown, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of readiness to find out. Stepping off the bustling street and into the office of Finch and Associates felt like entering a different era, a quiet sanctuary removed from the hurried pace of modern life. The air inside was cool, carrying the faint, pleasant scent of aged paper, polished leather, and furniture polish touched with something subtly like cedar. The walls were lined with dark, polished wood panels that rose towards a ceiling that seemed impossibly high, giving the room a sense of quiet grandeur. Bookshelves filled with legal tomes, their spines worn and faded with years of use, reached towards the ceiling, silent witnesses to decades of complex human affairs. Folders meticulously labeled by hand in neat, precise script were stacked in perfect rows in dark wood cabinets. It wasn't a sterile modern law firm with glass walls and minimalist furniture. It was a place that felt steeped in history, a repository of secrets kept safe and sound over decades. Arthur Finch looked exactly as if he belonged there, a guardian of this quiet history. Tall, older, with a shock of silver hair that seemed to catch the light, and eyes that were sharp and intelligent, yet held a discernible kindness. His presence wasn't loud or demanding, but it filled the room with a quiet authority, a sense of deep competence and integrity. His handshake was firm, warm, his skin dry and slightly rough. His voice was steady and calm, devoid of pretense or hurry. He didn't waste time with small talk or polite pleasantries. He simply gestured to a comfortable leather chair across from his large, solid desk, a beautiful antique piece with sturdy iron legs and a worn, smooth surface, and laid a single folder before me. The paper inside was thick cream-colored, the kind that rustled softly when touched, that felt substantial and important in your hands. It was tied with a thin, faded ribbon. This, he said, his tone gentle but formal, acknowledging the gravity of the moment has been waiting for you for a very long time, Margaret. He called me by my first name, not Ms. Vance, a small detail that resonated deeply in the vastness of my aloneness, a quiet recognition of the personal nature of this meeting. He opened the folder with deliberate movements and began to walk me through its contents, page by page, document by document. I listened in silence, perched on the edge of the chair, barely daring to breathe, trying to absorb the information he was laying out. Thomas Sterling, the man I had never known, the stranger who was my father, had indeed established a trust years ago. It wasn't a sprawling, ostentatious fortune that would make headlines or put me on lists of the wealthy elite. Nothing like that. But it was substantial. More than enough. A 6-figure account held in a secure investment fund, growing quietly and steadily over the years, managed conservatively under Arthur Finch's oversight. And crucially, a legal share in a commercial building. Not just any building, but a property located in a rising neighborhood not far from downtown Tucson. It was a mixed-use building. Commercial spaces on the ground floor, the rental units above. Tenants' leases a structure that had been generating income steadily, discreetly all these years, managed by a local firm under Mr. Finch's distant direction. There had been clear instructions from Thomas Sterling laid out in precise legal language in the trust documents. The assets were to remain untouched until I came forward, identified myself, proved my identity. No one else could claim them. Not distant relatives, not the state. If I never appeared, if I never found the letter, if I never reached out to Arthur Finch, the money and the property were to be liquidated and the proceeds donated to a scholarship fund established in Beatrice's name at the small college she had attended briefly, decades ago. A final quiet tribute from the man who had loved her, even from a distance, even when she wanted nothing from him. A way for his legacy and her memory to create good in the world. But I had come. I was here. And now, according to these documents, according to Arthur Finch, it was all mine. Arthur Finch reached across the surface of the desk, pushing a heavy old-fashioned pen towards me. You just need to sign to make it official. He said, his voice calm, steady, guiding me through the process. These final documents will transfer the ownership of the trust and its assets into your name. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled slightly, but it wasn't with fear or apprehension. It was with a complex current of emotion I couldn't name. Disbelief, relief, shock, a dawning sense of possibility, a profound sense of unexpected inheritance, not just of money, but of a history, a lineage, a connection I had never known existed. I signed my name at the bottom of the final document. Margaret Vance, my full name. The name scrawled on school permission, slips in Beatrice's hand, embroidered into my wedding veil by my own, whispered by Robert in his sleep. But this time, signing it felt profoundly different. It felt like ownership, not just of the assets, but of myself, of my own story, finally taking hold of the pen and writing the next line. When I was finished, our Arthur Finch looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer effusive congratulations, didn't make any trite remarks about new beginnings or good fortune. He simply nodded a quiet gesture of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the weight of the moment. He folded the papers neatly, precisely slipped them into a manila envelope, and placed it in my hands like an offering. It felt heavy, real, a tangible representation of the unexpected turn my life had taken. Thank you. I managed to say, my voice a little thick with emotion, a little hoarse. He stood as I did. We walked towards the door of his office, leaving the quiet sanctuary of history behind. The air outside the building was cold and crisp sharp, with the distinct quality of Denver air, the promise of a clear, bright day stretching ahead. A wind rushed down the street, whipping around the corners of buildings, tugging at my coat, carrying the sounds of the city. I stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, the manila envelope clutched against my chest. The city hummed around me. The roar of traffic, the hurried footsteps of passers-by, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of voices. But for a moment, the world seemed to pause, the sounds receding into the background. I tilted my face towards the wide blue sky and inhaled, deeply, fully, filling my lungs to their capacity. And for the first time in what felt like years, my lungs didn't stop short, didn't feel constricted. The breath filled me completely, expanding my chest, reaching all the way down to my toes, a physical sensation of being alive, fully present, allowed to exist. Not the shallow, hesitant breaths I'd been taking for so long, the ones you take when you're trying to make yourself small, when you're afraid to take up space, when you're trying to be invisible. A real breath, a breath that told my body it was allowed to exist again, fully and completely. I held it for a second, savoring the feeling of being filled with air and possibility, the unexpected lightness that had settled within me, then let it go in a long, quiet exhale. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh or raise my arms to the sky in a dramatic flourish like someone in a movie. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, the envelope pressed against my heart, and felt a profound shift happen inside me. It wasn't just relief, though, there was that. It wasn't just the closure of a mystery I hadn't known existed, though that was part of it. It was power. Not the kind you wield over others with aggression, not the kind you flaunt for attention, but the quiet kind, the kind that settles deep into your spine, that makes you stand a little taller, that changes the way you hold yourself, the kind you feel in the deepest part of your being, when you realize you don't have to beg anymore. Not for a place at the table, not for recognition, not for love, not for permission to simply exist. For so long I had lived in the shadows of other people's lives, defined by their choices, their needs, their willingness to include me, their subtle or not so subtle dismissals. I had been a guest in the life I helped build, holding my breath, stepping lightly, offering help. No one asked for, but everyone expected, trying desperately to earn a place that was never truly offered. And for what? A room in the basement. A silent eviction delivered with a false smile. A message that said, "You'll be better off somewhere else," meaning anywhere but here with us. But now I had a deed. I had a name on paper signed and witnessed, connected to something solid and real. I had something no one could take away, something no one could diminish or explain away with polite excuses or cutting remarks. I wasn't going back to Tucson. As the woman they dismissed, the woman they labeled a burden and tucked away like an extra suitcase in the basement of their lives. No, if I ever returned, I would walk in differently, not to reclaim what was lost, that life was gone, but to show them what they never saw in the first place, that I had strength they never knew existed, that I had a history they knew nothing about, that I had a name that belonged to me, a name they had never bothered to learn. Properly, a name attached to power they couldn't comprehend. But the truth was, even as I stood there feeling the weight of the envelope and the lightness in my lungs, I didn't actually want to go back to Tucson in any permanent sense. The idea of building something entirely new here in Denver or anywhere else that felt right filled me with a quiet hunger I hadn't felt since I was much younger, before grief and loneliness and rejection had dimmed my light. I didn't need revenge in the sense of tearing down their lives. I didn't need to force them to see me, to apologize, to regret. That kind of need felt distant now, less important than the need to simply be. I just needed space. Space to breathe. Space to build space, to put down roots that weren't tangled in the thorny growth of guilt and obligation. Space to simply exist for myself. As I walked down the block away from Arthur Finch's office and into the stream of city life, people passed me without a second glance. Just another woman walking down the street on a Tuesday morning. But I felt different. Taller, lighter, more present. I wasn't invisible anymore, not to myself. And that, I realized with a quiet certainty, was the only beginning I needed. A new name on a deed. A new chapter in the story. Mine. The decision to acquire the building in Tucson wasn't immediate. It formed slowly, deliberately, in the quiet weeks and months that followed my meeting with Arthur Finch. My life in Denver settled into a comfortable rhythm. I found a bright, airy apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a space that felt entirely my own, filled with light and possibility. The first morning I woke up there, the sun streaming in through the large windows, I lay in bed for a long time, simply breathing, savoring the silence that was not empty but full of potential. No creaking bed, no concrete walls, no distant sounds of a life I wasn't fully part of. Just stillness and light. I began to explore the city, rediscovering the simple pleasures of anonymity and independence. I spent hours in bookstores, lingered over coffee, in quiet cafes, walked in the abundant city parks, feeling the sun on my face, the crisp air in my lungs. I started knitting again, not out of boredom, or as a way to pass time in solitude, but because I wanted to finding a quiet satisfaction in the click of the needles, the creation of something tangible and beautiful from simple yarn. I even started taking a pottery class at a local community center, getting my hands dirty, shaping clay, finding a different kind of grounding. These were small things, perhaps, but they felt profoundly significant. They were activities chosen solely for myself, for my own quiet pleasure, not as a way to be useful to others, not as a means to an end. The money from Thomas Sterling's trust provided a foundation, a security I had never truly known, not even with Robert, because our security had been built together, shared, and when he was gone, half of it, the sense of shared future, had vanished too. This was different. This was mine, unequivocally. I didn't have to worry about making ends meet, about finding a job at my age, about being a burden to anyone. The freedom was intoxicating, not in a wild, reckless way, but in a quiet, deeply peaceful sense. It allowed me to breathe, to heal, to simply be. But as I healed, as I grew stronger, a different kind of clarity emerged. The pain of the past year hadn't vanished, but it had changed its nature. It was less a raw wound and more a scar, a reminder of where I had been, of what I had survived. And with that clarity came a quiet understanding of justice, not vengeance, which felt too angry, too consuming, but justice, a restoration of balance. They had taken so much. My sense of family, my peace, my financial contribution, my very dignity. They had discarded me. The Tucson building came to mind, the commercial property mentioned in my father's trust. It was part of what was now mine. I looked into it, working with Arthur Finch initially, then with a separate, impersonal property management firm in Tucson. I reviewed the financials, the tenant leases, the maintenance reports. It was a solid investment, quietly profitable. And it represented a tangible connection to the place where I had been diminished, where I had been cast out. The idea began to form, tentative at first, then growing stronger, more defined. What if I didn't just own a share of a building in Tucson? What if I owned a building in Tucson? A building that could, in some small, quiet way, represent the power I had found the ground I had reclaimed. I started researching properties for sale in Tucson, focusing on multi-unit residential buildings. It was a purely logical pursuit, at first an investment strategy. But as I scrolled through listings, as I looked at photographs of apartment buildings and duplexes, the idea solidified. It wasn't just about an investment, it was about a specific property. Through the property management firm, I was already working with a listing for a 12-unit building on the outskirts of the city came across my desk. A plain 2-story stucco building. Reading the description, looking at the photos, something resonated. The location, the type of building. It felt familiar, unsettlingly so. I asked the property manager to get more details, including a list of the current tenants, anonymized for privacy, initially, but indicating unit numbers and lease terms. Reviewing that list, one entry leapt out at me. Unit 2C, leased beginning approximately a year ago. Tenant names anonymized, but the move-in date aligned eerily with the approximate time they would have needed a new place after the house I had helped them buy was no longer theirs. I instructed the manager to verify the names in Unit 2C. A few days later, the confirmation came back. Unit 2C, Clara and Martin Hayes, the house I had helped them buy. They had presumably lost it. Financial difficulties perhaps exacerbated by Martin's presumed poor financial management or a change in his job status. It didn't matter how. They had lost the house I had helped anchor them, to the house where they had made me feel like a burden, and now they were renting in a building that was for sale. The idea crystallized sharp and clear. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about a specific kind of cosmic irony I hadn't orchestrated, but which fate had laid at my feet. I decided to buy the building, all of it, working through Arthur Finch and a network of discreet legal and financial contacts. He recommended I set up Sterling Properties, LLC. The name, deliberate, quiet nod to my father, the source of this unexpected turn of fortune. The company was designed for anonymity, a legal shield. My name would be nowhere on public record as the owner. The purchase process took several weeks. Negotiations, inspections, legal work. It was complex, requiring focus and attention to detail, a welcome distraction from dwelling on the past. During this time, I instructed the property management firm, the one that would continue to operate the building under my ownership, to gather detailed information about the tenants, including their specific lease agreements. Reviewing Clara and Martin's lease, I noted the clause allowing for rent increases upon change of ownership or market reassessment. It was standard boilerplate likely overlooked by them in their haste to secure a rental. The sale closed on a Wednesday, quietly, impersonally. I received the notification in my email. The building was now mine. I remember sitting at my desk in Denver looking at the confirmation email, then switching to the property management dashboard. The building address was listed under Sterling Properties, LLC, and there under Unit 2C were the names Hayes, Clara, and Martin. They moved in on a Thursday, just 2 days after the sale finalized. They were likely given short notice by the previous owner who was eager to close the deal. I received the notification from the property manager that Unit 2C was being occupied by the new tenants who had signed the lease just before the sale. I didn't go to Tucson for their move. I didn't need to. I had already arranged for discreet security cameras to be installed throughout the common areas of the building. The parking lot, the hallway, the laundry room. A silent, unblinking eye, I watched the grainy feed later that day. A large moving truck much too big for the narrow drive pulling into the parking lot. I saw Clara step out looking flustered, running a hand through her highlighted hair carrying a clipboard. Then Martin, already looking annoyed, gesturing impatiently at the movers. I watched them interact with the cheerful leasing agent I had hired signing papers accepting keys. They were tired, stressed, focused on the logistics of moving. They didn't notice the small new cameras near the entrance. They didn't notice the subtle upgrades already beginning. Fresh mulch around the palm trees, the promise of a repainted hallway visible near the entrance. They just saw a place to live a roof over their heads. My roof. That night back in my quiet apartment in Denver, the city lights twinkling below like scattered jewels, I sat at my writing desk. I had the property management dashboard open on my screen. Unit 2C. Clara Hayes. Martin Hayes. I reviewed their lease again, specifically the rent amount. Then I opened the section for rent adjustments. My fingers paused over the keyboard a moment of quiet deliberation. This wasn't a decision made in anger, not a fit of rage. It was calculated. It was a consequence. I typed the new amount. It was 3 times their current rent. Beneath the new figure in the digital notes section, I added, adjustment to reflect revised market value, based on unit-specific assessment effective immediately. No explanations, no exceptions. For the other units, I approved a standard modest rent increase of 5%, well within market rate, easily justifiable. It was enough to make the overall financials look normal to avoid drawing undue attention from other tenants. But for Unit 2C, it was a shock. A deliberate, calculated squeeze applied through the impersonal machinery of property management. I pressed save. The email went out automatically the next morning, generated by the system. A standard notice sent to all tenants, outlining the upcoming rent adjustments. Neutral language legal boilerplate a formality. For most, a small expected increase. For Unit 2C, it was an earthquake delivered in digital form. 3 days passed in silence. On the 4th day, I received an alert through the management portal. A message from a tenant in Unit 2C. Request for clarification on rent adjustment. The name attached was the generic placeholder used by the leasing agency, initially not Clara or Martin, directly, but I knew it was them. I watched as the messages piled up over the next few days, filtering through the property manager. The tone shifted from polite confusion to barely concealed anger, then to frustration and desperation. Martin's influence was evident in the sharp, demanding language. Short sentences, capital letters, words like unfair, outrageous, extortion, illegal. They demanded an explanation, a justification for an increase that felt arbitrary and punitive. I said nothing. I responded to no one directly. I instructed the property manager to respond on my behalf, using pre-approved scripts and polite rejections that offered no real information. Market correction. Annual review. Terms were disclosed at signing. They had signed the lease willingly, even eagerly, looking relieved to have found a place, after presumably losing their house. They hadn't read the fine print closely enough too, focused on securing a place to live. The irony of it all settled heavy in my chest, a secret too perfectly sculpted to spoil, with words a consequence they had unwittingly leased from me. I didn't visit the property in person. I didn't need to. The discreet security cameras I had installed throughout the common areas of the building, in the hallways, the parking lot, near the mailboxes, near the laundry room, gave me everything I wanted to see. Silent footage, the flicker of fluorescent lights on tired, stressed faces, the weight of expression when Clara walked past the rent drop box, her jaw tight, her shoulders slumped, a stack of envelopes in her hand. Martin storming out one morning, slamming the front door so hard, I saw the camera feed shake from the impact. None of the other tenants complained about the small increase. They paid it perhaps, grumbling a little, but accepting it as a normal part of renting. Only Unit 2C fought back, sending increasingly desperate messages, demanding to know who the owner was. I wasn't cruel in any overt way. I didn't leave nasty notes on their door. I didn't yell at them, didn't harass them. I simply applied pressure, quietly, legally, systematically, and I never broke my silence. The building itself began to change subtly under my ownership. I approved funds for repainting the dingy hallway walls in a soft, neutral color, replacing the worn carpet with new laminate flooring that was easier to clean and brighter. I upgraded the landscaping out front, adding drought-tolerant plants and a small bench near the entrance. Small changes that improved the lives of the other tenants, making the building a slightly more pleasant place to live. I gave small rent reductions to the single mother in 3B, who was working 2 jobs, to Mrs. Gable in 1A after her husband passed away. Small acts of quiet kindness that were within my power to give for people who saw me through the manager as a benevolent, albeit distant owner. But not to Unit 2C. They received no discount, no special consideration, no warmth. Only cold, impersonal notices slipped under their door, rent reminders, late fees, warnings. Sometimes late at night in my Denver apartment, I would open the tenant dashboard and reread their lease, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, just to remind myself that it was real, that they were living under my roof, paying me for the privilege, paying for the right to wake up each morning in a place I owned, breathing the air I allowed them to breathe. It wasn't revenge, I continued to tell myself. Revenge felt too much like something that consumed the avenger as much as the target. This was balance, a quiet kind of justice, wordless and slow, the kind that doesn't need to be witnessed to count. They didn't need to know my name. They didn't need to hear my voice. All they needed was to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. A life made slightly less comfortable, increasingly precarious. A burden with no name, just like the one they had made me feel I was. And still I waited. Not for an apology, not for a thank you. I waited perhaps for the moment they would finally break through the anonymity and demand, with full understanding, who owns this place. And when they did, if they did, it wouldn't matter. Because by then I wouldn't just be their landlord. I would be the silence they never saw coming, the reckoning they had, in a way, brought upon themselves. The first call came from an unknown number while I was making coffee in my quiet Denver kitchen one morning. I watched it ring the screen, displaying only a city and state, Tucson, Arizona. The familiar knot of tension, long dormant, tightened slightly in my stomach. I didn't answer. Then another call, a different number, but the same area code, the same sense of urgency radiating through the electronic connection. I let them ring until they stopped. The voicemails followed. Voices I didn't recognize, immediately tenants from the building, hesitant, confused, then frustrated. Vague questions about lease changes, about the rent, about the unforeseen increase that was making things impossible. They never used my name. They couldn't. The anonymity of Sterling Properties LLC, managed by the impersonal property management firm, was my shield, my protection. On paper, I was just a silent investor, an unreachable owner somewhere else. But the messages kept coming, filtering through the system, reaching my inbox. Then the texts began. First from unknown numbers, short, blunt, demanding answers. Then one from a contact I had deleted from my phone. Long ago, a name I thought I had excised from my life, put firmly in the past. Clara. Her name, once a symbol of family, of rescue, of connection, now flashed on the screen, a jarring intrusion into the quiet rhythm of my new life. She didn't start with a greeting, no Aunt Margaret, or even a simple hi. Just a plea stark and raw in the white text bubble devoid of preamble or context. Please, if there's anything you can do about the rent, let me know. We're drowning. It's impossible. I stared at the words. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, 100 different responses flashing through my mind. Angry retorts detailing their past actions, cold legalistic dismissals even for a fleeting second, a flicker of the old instinct to soothe, to fix, to help. But I stopped. My fingers stilled. I didn't type a word. The silence was my answer. It was more powerful than any combination of letters, any explanation, any justification. It was the sound of a door closing, a deliberate chosen silence that mirrored the one they had imposed on me. More followed over the next few days. Texts, emails, voicemails. Her voice was thin-strained, cracking with fatigue and desperation. Aunt Margaret. I don't know who else to ask. The new landlord, whoever they are, they're making it impossible to live here. The rent. We can't afford it. Martin's getting worse. He's so stressed about money. The kids don't sleep. We're behind on everything. If you know anything, please. Is there someone we can talk to? Someone who can explain? Still, I said nothing. I remained a silent, unseen presence. At night, I would sometimes stand by the window of my Denver apartment and look out across the quiet courtyard thousands of miles from the building I owned in Tucson. I could call up the grainy security feed on a separate monitor. I could see their unit from certain angles. I could see their lights flicker inconsistently, sometimes blazing bright. Late into the night, sometimes dark early, suggesting arguments, tension early nights born of exhaustion or despair. I imagined them inside arguing over bills, over blame, over each other, their carefully constructed life cracking under the pressure of an invisible force. It wasn't hard to picture. I'd lived in the shadow of their relationship, witnessed their dynamics, overheard their tensions long enough to know the sound and shape of their tempers when they were stretched thin. I remembered the day Martin threw away the dinner I'd made, the casual cruelty of it, calling it old people food, the dismissive wave of his hand. I remembered his snide comments about my clothes, my presence, my attempts to connect. I remembered the way they both smirked when I seemed out of touch or naive, confirming their unspoken belief in my obsolescence. I remembered the suffocating weight of packing my life into 2 bags in the cold, silent basement, while Clara stood at the top of the stairs watching me go, her face a mask of practiced pity, sending me off to a life she had deemed more appropriate for me, a life she believed would be happier. That memory no longer held the power to wound me. It was just a fact, solid and unmovable, like a monument to a version of me they thought had been permanently defeated, permanently invisible. Now I stood in my own apartment, hardwood floors beneath my feet, high ceilings stretching above me, south-facing windows that flooded the space with golden light each morning, a physical embodiment of the space I had claimed for myself. A comfortable armchair by the window, a vase of fresh flowers on the table, a selection of books on shelves lining the walls. Small details, perhaps, but they spoke volumes about a life lived on my own terms. I bought the flowers every Friday, not for anyone else, but for myself. A small act of self-care, a reminder of the beauty that still existed. Each morning I made my coffee exactly the way I liked it. 2 sugars, a generous splash of oat milk, brewed just shy of boiling. I took my time sipping it sitting by the window reading the newspaper in print, the rustle of pages a comforting sound in the quiet apartment. I wasn't rushed. No one barked orders. No one asked what I was making for dinner. My life was my own again in fundamental ways I hadn't realized I had surrendered during that long year in their basement. The messages from Clara kept coming a trickle of desperation in the face of the implacable silent pressure. I know we haven't been close, Aunt Margaret, and I'm sorry for things that happened. She wrote in one text the closest she had come to an apology or acknowledgement. But please, this new landlord, they're making it impossible to live here. We don't know what to do. That one made me pause slightly longer. Not out of a sudden surge of pity for her, not a flood of the old affection that had once bound me to her, but because of the phrasing. They're making it impossible to live here. Still, even in her desperation, she focused the blame outwards, on the faceless entity on the situation. Still no hint of true understanding of introspection, of acknowledging her own part in creating the circumstances that had led her to this point, or that her current hardship might be a consequence, a painful echo of their past actions. Just blame. Blame directed at the invisible force that was applying pressure. When their carefully constructed world began to crack, just as my world had cracked when they had applied their own quiet pressure. Some nights, catching my reflection in the darkened window pane, the city lights a blur behind me. I was startled by how different I looked. It wasn't just the shorter, darker hair, the tailored clothes I now wore that fit my form rather than hiding it. Something in my face had changed. It was quieter, settled, etched with experience, but also with a deep inner peace. The woman staring back had fewer questions in her eyes. She no longer searched for approval in the eyes of others. She simply stood still, watchful, self-possessed. I didn't feel joy in their pain. That felt too small, too mean-spirited, too much like the very cruelty I had endured. But I did feel justice. Justice, I was learning, wasn't always loud or dramatic. It didn't always arrive in the form of courtroom verdicts, or public apologies, or grand pronouncements. Sometimes it was as simple as the phone calls. You didn't answer the messages. You didn't return the silence you held like a shield, impenetrable and unwavering. It was the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming control. I wasn't seeking revenge, not in the traditional sense of inflicting suffering for its own sake. I was claiming space, the space I had once begged for with every meal I cooked, every load of laundry I folded every night. I sat alone in that cold basement, wondering what part of myself I had to shrink, to deny, to erase, in order to be deemed worthy of love, of belonging. Now I didn't shrink. I expanded. I grew into the woman I used to imagine only in my most private daydreams. The woman I might have been if grief hadn't crippled me, if loneliness hadn't made me vulnerable. The one who didn't need to explain herself, didn't need to ask permission, didn't need to be small to be safe. And yet, when I looked at the grainy camera feed showing their windows, when I saw their silhouettes moving like shadows behind the cheap blinds, I didn't hate them. The feeling was simpler, cleaner, less emotionally charged. I just no longer needed them. Their approval, their affection, their acceptance. It held no power over me anymore. Their opinion of me was irrelevant. That, I realized, was the real victory. Not their suffering, but my release from the need for their validation, my freedom from the cage of their perception. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the generic scent of commercial carpet cleaner, clean but impersonal. Folding chairs set up in neat rows creaked softly as people settled in adjusting coats and bags, murmuring low greetings to neighbors. A small community gathered for a routine purpose. I arrived early deliberately and chose a seat near the front, slightly to the side. Not because I wanted to be the center of attention, but because I wanted to see clearly, unobstructed. To see their faces, to witness their reactions when the moment came. The afternoon sun slanted in through the tall windows behind me, outlining my silhouette in a pale, almost ethereal light, making it difficult for people facing me to see my features clearly initially. I wore a charcoal gray suit. It was tailored sharp at the shoulders, as soft at the cuffs, a quiet statement of confidence and professionalism. My hair was shorter now, a sleek dark cut that framed my face, styled in a way that made me feel both entirely new and entirely myself. In my lap I held a slim leather folder. Inside were documents I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. They were just symbols now, symbols of the steps I had taken from the night I stood outside their house with 2 suitcases and a fractured heart. Symbols of silence turned into structure of dignity, reclaimed of power quietly earned. People filed in slowly, tenants from the building. Some I recognized from email exchanges or brief glimpses on the security feed. Others were new faces to me. A few nodded politely as they passed my seat, assuming I was just another tenant, perhaps someone new to the building, someone here to learn about the recent changes. One man, Mr. Henderson from 1A, the tenant whose leak I'd had fixed, promptly smiled warmly. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. "Thanks again for getting that leak fixed so quickly. Appreciate it." I returned his smile with a quiet nod, a small, genuine interaction that felt worlds away from the tension I anticipated. Then the door opened again, and I felt it before I saw them. A subtle shift in the energy of the room, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Clara. She stepped inside looking tired and stressed, just as she had in the camera feeds. Her blouse was wrinkled, her jeans faded, her shoulders slightly slumped. She held a small notebook, clutched against her chest, like a shield, her fingers tight around it. Martin followed behind her. His walk was still the same. Too loud, too wide, his presence inflated, demanding space filling the doorway. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted quickly around the room, scanning faces looking for a target, someone to blame for their predicament, someone to confront about the impossible rent. He didn't find me. They didn't recognize me. Clara walked within 3 feet of where I sat, her gaze sweeping over me. Polite, cursory, moving on without pause, registering me as just another anonymous face in the room. Like wind over glass. She saw a shape, a presence, but registered nothing deeper. No history, no connection. I studied her in that moment, unseen, the way her shoulders were pulled slightly inward as if protecting herself from an anticipated blow. The fine lines around her mouth that deepened when she frowned, a permanent etching of stress. This wasn't the vibrant, hopeful girl I had raised. This was a woman etched by years of strain, by choices she couldn't undo, by a silence she had never prepared to break, or perhaps had never known how to. I waited. The building manager, the pleasant professional, Mr. Evans I had hired, stood at the front of the room and began the meeting. Routine updates about the building, notices about the recent upgrades, the new flooring, the repainted hallways, the improved landscaping. Clarifications about new policies, including the rent adjustments. The low hum of procedural business filled the air, a mundane backdrop to the drama I was about to unveil. Martin leaned over and whispered something to Clara too low for me to hear from this distance, but his expression was clear. Annoyance, frustration. He rolled his eyes dramatically. Clara didn't respond, her gaze fixed straight ahead on Mr. Evans, her face impassive. Then Mr. Evans turned his head and nodded once, a silent cue directed at me, the prearranged signal. I stood. The sound of my chair scraping back on the tiled floor was soft, barely audible above the general murmuring in the room, but in my ears it rang like a bell, clear and resonant. I walked to the front of the room. Each step was measured deliberate, carrying the weight of my journey, the weight of the past year and the decades that came before. The floor underfoot was cool and clean. I felt the familiar stiffness of my blazer around my ribs, the smooth leather of the folder in my hand. My pulse was steady, my breath calm. I reached the front and turned to face the room, the sunlight behind me casting my figure in a pale glow. My voice when I spoke was calm, clear and quiet. It carried easily in the quiet room, commanding attention, not through volume but through its stillness, its unexpected presence. "Good afternoon," I said. "My name is Margaret Vance, and I am the owner of this building." That was all. Just my name, my title, nothing more. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. I watched the realization ripple through the room, starting with the tenants nearest me, spreading outward. A few people looked confused, then surprised, glancing at each other, then back at me. Recognition dawning slowly on some faces who might have seen my name on a notice or heard it mentioned by the manager. Then I saw it the moment it reached Clara. Her mouth parted slightly, a small silent O of disbelief. Her eyes widened, fixed on my face. Recognition flooding into them like a tidal wave. Her hand clutching the notebook against her chest, tightened until her knuckles were white. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She sat frozen in her chair, her gaze locked onto mine across the now silent room. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were wide open, filled with something I couldn't name. Something raw and exposed. Shock, disbelief, horror. The sudden brutal understanding of how everything connected. The money for the house, the basement room, the eviction, the anonymous landlord, the impossible, rent the woman standing before her, now calm and in control. Martin, however, reacted with the same noise and bluster. He always carried his default response to anything he couldn't control. He surged to his feet, his chair crashing back against the wall behind him, a loud, jarring sound that shattered the stillness. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face turning a mottled red. He yelled. He called the rent hikes criminal. He accused the building of being run by a fraud. He demanded to know what kind of game was being played, who I thought I was. His voice was loud, his words a torrent of angry accusations, but his bluster felt thin now, hollow, lacking the power it once held over me. For the first time in my life, I saw Martin as small. Not because I had grown physically larger, but because he had finally been knocked off the platform of my silence, the silence he had so comfortably stood upon. He didn't know what to do with the version of me standing before him. The quiet woman he'd called the Splinter, the antique, the old lady down in the dungeon, was now the undeniable owner, the source of the pressure that was crushing him. His fists didn't clench. He seemed lost, his anger lacking its usual target because the target wasn't flinching, wasn't retreating. Clara remained frozen in her seat, pale silent. Her eyes flickered from Martin to me and back again, like a spectator at a tennis match. She couldn't comprehend. Her mouth moved once, twice, forming silent words that didn't emerge before closing again. I could see the weight of recognition settling over her, the dots connecting the lines tracing backward to the basement, to the bags, to the silence she had let grow between us for too long. The silence that had now become my most powerful tool, a language she was finally being forced to understand. Still, I said nothing in response to Martin's outburst. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to explain. Their reactions were explanation enough. The truth revealed quietly did its own work. I turned to Mr. Evans, the building manager, who looked momentarily stunned but quickly regained his composure. I thanked him quietly for facilitating the meeting. I gave a small inclusive nod to the other tenants in the room, acknowledging their presence, their validity as residents. Then I turned and walked towards the door. I didn't rush. Each step was deliberate, carrying me out of the room, out of that moment of confrontation and revelation. I didn't slam the door behind me in a gesture of dramatic finality. I didn't deliver a final cutting speech about betrayal or justice or my journey. I simply left. But I didn't lock the door behind me. I left it open just enough. Not because I expected them to follow me out to confront me again, to demand answers I wasn't going to give, but because they needed to know that I hadn't been the one who shut it in the first place. They had closed the door on me long ago, on our shared history, on my place in their lives. Now, I was simply leaving it open for them to see what was on the other side, the life I had built, the person I had become, the power I held. The choice to cross the threshold to speak, to acknowledge, was theirs. I knew with a quiet certainty they wouldn't, and they didn't. I sold the building exactly 1 year after the day I first stepped into that tenant meeting room in Tucson and faced the people who had once made me feel invisible. It wasn't a dramatic decision born of frustration or a need to finally wash my hands of them. There was no final argument, no sudden revelation that prompted it. It was quiet, intentional, and deeply mine, a feeling of completion. I signed the papers in the same lawyer's office in Denver, where I had first learned about the unexpected inheritance from my father. The room still held the same quiet atmosphere. The windows still overlooked the street with the same dusty blinds. The air still smelled of old paper and polish. But I was not the same woman who had walked in there, clinging to a letter and a name, unsure of her future. I was changed fundamentally and irrevocably. The sale went smoothly, efficiently. Another impersonal transaction handled by lawyers and property managers. The money transferred to my account in silence, a clean exchange of ownership. I didn't buy anything extravagant with it, not this time either. The temptation was minimal. Possessions felt less important than peace. No sprawling mansion, no luxury car, no grand tour of Europe. Those things felt superficial, external markers of success that held little appeal for me now. I had other plans, the kind that didn't need applause or external recognition, to matter the kind that felt like building something real, something good. Not just for myself, but in quiet tribute to the women who had shaped my life, and the women I now wanted to help shape theirs. I took a substantial portion of the money, a sum that felt significant and purposeful, and used it to open a small center in Flagstaff, Arizona. Not too far from Tucson geographically, but a world away in terms of purpose and atmosphere. It was a support space specifically for women like me. Women who had been silenced, sidelined, shut out. Women who had carried the weight of whole families on their backs, emotionally, physically, sometimes financially, only to be told they were no longer needed, no longer belonged, discarded when their usefulness waned. Women navigating grief divorce, the quiet ache of being overlooked in a youth-obsessed world. I named the center Elelanor House, a combination of my name and my mother, Beatrice's name. A quiet tribute to the two women whose lives in different ways had led me to this purpose. It felt right. Beatrice had lived much of her life in the shadows, fiercely, independent, loving, deeply and quietly, her strength often unseen. It was time her name, our name, stood on something solid, something seen, something that offered light to others. The center wasn't large. It occupied a modest space in a quiet part of town with 3 comfortable rooms, a small library, a gathering space, a room for quiet reflection, and a shared kitchen that quickly became the heart of the place. But it was warm. There was always hot coffee brewing, always a comfortable armchair to sink into, and always someone ready to listen without judgment, without expectation, simply holding space for another woman's story. I volunteered there often, especially in the early days, wanting to be present to offer the quiet support I had so desperately needed. I hosted journaling circles, facilitated group discussions, helped women draft resumes, find resources, or simply sat with them in silence when that was all they needed. I wrote letters to women who reached out from towns I had never heard of, writing back words of encouragement, letting them know they weren't alone, that their pain was seen, that their stories mattered. I understood that need better than almost anyone. But for myself, I needed something even quieter, something that felt like a final, deep anchoring, a place of true solitude and peace. I searched for it, not on real estate websites or through brokers, but by asking around, by listening to quiet conversations, by trusting intuition, by waiting for the right place to reveal itself. And then one crisp autumn morning I found it. A small house nestled near a lake outside Whitefish, Montana. It wasn't perfect. It was old, needing work. The roof needed repair. The porch creaked loudly underfoot. The garden had long been abandoned, overrun with wild mint and tangled blackberry vines that scratched at your ankles. But when I stood by the edge of the water, the lake's surface still and reflective like a mirror, and looked at the way the vast Montana sky met the distant pine-covered mountains, at the quiet reflection of the clouds on the water, I knew. This was it. This was where I would live the rest of my story. Not in exile, not in bitterness, not defined by the past, but in peace, in quiet connection to the natural world, in solitude that felt like sanctuary, not loneliness. I bought the house. I moved in with only what truly mattered, what fit into a few boxes, and my car. My mother's worn diary, its pages filled with a life I was still slowly discovering, a connection to a past that felt less like a burden and more like a root. A few carefully chosen photographs. Robert's smile, Beatrice's laughing face, a picture of me and Clara as girls, before the world changed us. The worn baking tin that still carried the faint, comforting smell of cinnamon, if I closed my eyes just right, a reminder of shared kitchens and simple joys. I painted the walls myself in soft blues and warm grays colors that felt like the sky, and the stone colors that soothed. I built bookshelves along one wall in the living room, filling them with stories. I cleared the overgrown garden, planting tomatoes and herbs in the spring wildflowers in the fall, coaxing beauty from the neglected earth, a small act of creation. I baked bread every Saturday morning, the kind that filled the small house with a smell that felt like a warm embrace, a sense of deep comfort even if no one else was there to share it, the simple act of kneading and waiting a meditation. Eventually I got a dog, a quiet mutt from a local shelter past the puppy stage, with eyes that seemed to hold a world of gentle understanding. She had a crooked tail and a quiet nature content to lie near me while I read or wrote. I named her June after the month my life had begun again, after the month I had found the letter from my father, the month I had stepped onto the path of reclaiming myself. She would lie curled at my feet, her soft snores a comforting rhythm in the quiet house, a warm breathing presence that asked for nothing but kindness and offered unwavering companionship. Sometimes walking by the lake in the early morning, when the fog was still curled like breath across the water, the air cool and crisp, I thought about all the versions of myself I had outgrown. The woman who waited for thank yous, who measured her worth in utility, who whispered apologies just for taking up space. The woman who mistook survival for living, who endured rather than lived. I no longer saw her with judgment, but with a quiet compassion. She had done her best with the tools she had in the circumstances she faced. Now I had different tools, a different path. I continued to write letters to the women who came to Elilana House, women who needed to hear what I had learned, what I had found. I told them it was never too late to start over to find your own path, that endings were not failures but opportunities to choose a different direction, a different story. That silence wasn't weakness, if it was chosen a deliberate refusal to engage with noise that sought to diminish you, but a source of strength. That starting over didn't mean erasing who you had been. It meant reclaiming her piece by piece stronger and more whole. And then one blustery autumn day, tucked in amongst the electricity bill and a coupon flyer in my mailbox, I found the postcard. It was addressed to me by name. No return address, no name on the front. Just a photograph of a serene lake scene on the front, uncannily similar to the one outside my window. The mountains in the distance, the quiet water. Inside there were only 2 lines written in soft, uncertain handwriting. The script, small and hesitant. I understand now. I'm sorry. Thank you for teaching me. No signature. No hint of who it was from, though the handwriting stirred a faint distant familiarity. My hands trembled slightly as I read it standing there by my mailbox on the quiet rural road. I didn't know for sure if it was Clara. I never would. And maybe I thought tracing the uncertain lines with my fingertip, that was the point. It didn't need confirmation. Some messages are felt more deeply than they are read. Some apologies don't arrive wrapped in clarity or grand gestures or tearful phone calls. They come folded in silence, stitched into the spaces where trust was once torn, where connection was broken. But I felt it. A quiet acknowledgement, a flicker of understanding reaching across the distance, across the years of silence and pain. And that was enough. It wasn't about forgiveness, not in a grand, sweeping sense. It was about a release, an acknowledgement that the lesson, though painful, had been learned, that the silence had, in its own way, spoken volumes. I placed the postcard carefully in a small wooden frame I had on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, nestled amongst other cherished objects. It sat there unassuming right next to the photo of me and June sitting together on the porch swing, right next to the dried bouquet I had made from the first wildflowers that bloomed in my garden, right next to the framed photo of Robert still smiling. That little postcard became more than just paper. It was a symbol, proof that pain could teach that silence could be a source of power, that connection once broken could perhaps find a new quiet form. It was proof that the loudest declaration of, "I am strong, I am here, I am home," often comes with no voice at all, only a heartbeat, a breath, a choice. And in that house by that lake with bread rising in the oven and a dog curled contentedly at my feet, surrounded by the quiet beauty I had cultivated, I knew something I had once feared I'd never believe, again something deeper and more true than any external validation. I was home, not because I had found the perfect place on a map, a physical location where I finally fit, but because I had finally become it. I was home within myself.